Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're so excited about this event. My name is Eduardo. I am a community events manager at Modern Sales Pros and your host for the next hour. Those of you not familiar with Modern Sales Pros, you are 100% missing out because we are the world's largest revenue leadership community for people in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, and the related supporting disciplines. Our mission is to create a great environment for our 20,000 and growing members to answer questions they would struggle to solve on their own and help them see solutions they not know about. With the support of 20,000 people, I am sure no questions will be left unanswered and no problems will be left unsolved. We engage with our amazing community through great live sessions like the one you're about to experience today and through our robust online forum and in the near future, hopefully in-person events. And we also have an amazing summit every quarter. So if you love learning from revenue leaders, you will love our 3-day Revenue Excellence Summit happening on from April 12th through April 14th. We put together 11 events, 11 amazing events for you with speakers from amazing companies from all over the US. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat right now so everyone can sign up for our summit. But for right now, let's focus on how to get the most out of this event. I have some housekeeping notes for us. So first, this event is being recorded. You'll be able to access this recording in the key takeaways from our speakers in the previous events page of the MSP website. So you can always have great information handy when you most need it. And second, if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function and we'll be sure to get to them during the event. And I am sure our speakers will love to answer all the questions that you have. So make sure you use the Q&A. This event today is sponsored by Blueboard, our amazing partner. And I have Brit here with me. She's the Senior Enterprise Account Executive at Blueboard to introduce us to the amazing work they're doing. Brit, can you tell us a little bit about Blueboard?
I absolutely can. Thank you, Eduardo, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As he was mentioning, Blueboard is the sponsor of today's event, and what we focus on is creating meaningful moments for employees through experiential recognition. And what I mean by that is instead of getting a gift card or a cash bonus that disappears into a paycheck, imagine taking your family on a hot air balloon ride or surprising your mom with a weekend getaway. And all of that is because your employer wanted to recognize the great work you were doing. So we're helping bring that human connection into the workplace through our recognition platform.
Thank you very much, Brit. That sounds really fun. I love the work that Blueboard does. And now I want to introduce you to our fabulous moderator for today, Andrew Morton. Please, Andrew, introduce yourself, give us a little bit of background, and you can take it from here. I hope you all enjoy it, and I'll be back on for a few closing notes at the end. But Andrew, that's your time to shine. Please take it from here.
Thanks, Eduardo. I feel like that introduction might have been a little too kind, so you've set a high bar for me to live up to. But glad to be joining everybody today. As Eduardo said, my name is Andrew Morton. I am the Vice President of Sales at a company called User Voice. I am also a coffee lover, a dad, a repeat MSP host, and just really excited to be here to have this conversation. So before we switch over and get kicked off on the agenda, obviously Britt had an opportunity to introduce herself. Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you do a quick introduction. Tell us who you are and who you're with.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Mike Cabot. I head up sales at Moogsoft. But more recently, I was heading up the corporate team at Malwarebytes, and we were a customer of Blueboard, actually. I've been doing startup stuff for a while, small and big, and so you get a chance to sort of work with a variety of environments, and excited to talk more about avoiding burnout today.
Yeah, big topic. Cool, awesome. So I guess to kick us off, I just want to kind of set the precedent for agenda, what we're going to talk through today. We're going to break this conversation really down into 3 parts. We want to start to have a conversation around how to identify, start to classify some of the burnout that's happening on your team, what to look for, how do I again, to categorize it, what challenges, the way that may materialize within employee efforts. Then we want to move on to the consequences of employee burnout. What's going to happen to your bottom line? What impact is that going to have on the business? And ultimately, then we want to have a conversation around avoiding burnout, right? How can we sort of preempt or circumvent this burnout, put in place best practices to either resolve it or ultimately to keep it from happening? So pretty good conversation lined up for you guys. As Eduardo mentioned, if you all have questions, please drop them into the QA or into the chat. I'm going to be monitoring those throughout the conversation, and we'll try to pepper them in. We'll also leave time at the end of this conversation to move through any Q&A that we may not have covered. So yeah, so to kick it off, before we kind of dive deep into the agenda topics, I wanted to pick Mike and Britt, both your brains on this particular thing. And Britt, you actually brought this up before the event. You were kind of talking about this a little bit, like this sort of emphasis on employee burnout. Like it's this common topic. You said you're getting spammed from Tony Robbins about this stuff. So it's just, it's really interesting. It's definitely a hot topic. So Britt, I'll start with you. Why do you think employee burnout has become such a pressing issue for organizations today?
Yeah, well, if you look at the end result, right, employee burnout leads to employee turnover, and we are experiencing the great resignation within the workplace, particularly in the sales space, actually. Very high turnover within sales reps, probably on average about 40% higher than the rest of the organization. And what we're focusing on now is how do we shift away from being reactive to proactive? And it's materializing itself in a lot of different ways. So companies are kind of throwing darts at a wall thinking, does that mean we need more wellness? Does that mean we need to recognize them more? Does that mean, and how do we encompass all of this at once? And it's showing up for people in different ways too, right? You guys are invited into my home right now. My little dog is going to walk past you at some point in time, and I have to act like that's okay. But it could be equally as stressful if she was sick in the background, right? And so how are we really meeting our employees where they're at and making sure that our programs or the ways we support them are really targeting them as individuals so that we're preventing that end result of them turning over?
Sure. It's really well said. It's at least encouraging that people are starting to think like proactively about burnout, though, right? Like it's less reactionary, and people are actually trying to take steps now to prevent it. So, Mike, I would ask you the same question. I'm curious, why do you think that this has become such a pressing issue? Why companies are now are recognizing it and trying to do something to prevent it?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's a culture shift, right? Away from just sort of just go all the time, and people are realizing that we need to think more holistically about people, and ultimately, it's both the right thing to do. It's also the right business decision. You get more out of people when you think like that, but it's also the right thing to do, just to take care of people. I mean, it's been said, right? But COVID and work from home. When you think about with COVID, everything that's going on in the world, all that's a lot of extra stress on people. That's just sort of hanging on, and so whether people, I think, recognize it or not, that's stuff that's causing stress and burnout. And then work from home. I mean, even if you're a work from home company, there's just less opportunity to have those social interactions. I mean, I think, I was at Malwarebytes, the shift to home was really hard. It was like, I'm not going to just see you in the kitchen. We're not going to just walk to get coffee or get lunch. And, anyway, so I think those things have kind of gone away and made it a lot harder to, I think, have some of those sort of happier, fun, connected times that maybe would have helped avoid.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We face the same challenges with our GTM team, and like, how do you navigate this new sort of digital connection and try to make the same interactions happen? So definitely a common problem. So you touched on something there that I wanted to kick off with the agenda, and so Mike, I'll kind of pose this question to you first. It's just kind of a natural transition. So where we want to start is like, how do we start to identify and classify these different types of burnout? Most organizations have moved to a remote, or at least a partially remote working environment. And I'm curious, from your perspective, given the shift, right, this change in culture, this change in work environment, what are some of the tactics that you're using to identify employee burnout? How are you identifying it within the organization, and how are you looking for it within your teams?
Yeah, one of the things that I look at is how much time people take off, and looking at that across the org. And it's one of those things where you don't want people to take too much time off, but you also don't want people to take not enough time off. And what I found is that a lot of the people that don't take a lot of time off don't take it off because there's other people that are sort of taking so much time off, they feel like they can't go away. So one of the things that I've done is really look at the last 12 months, anywhere I am, and just see are people sort of, is this equitable, or is there a sort of a reasonable level of time off across people? So that's one thing to identify. I think also looking for people who've just been in the same job for a while, right? And I always think, that like if nothing has changed in their world and they're just sort of cranking along, I think that also can create burnout. And so finding ways to help them either learn new skills or look for a promotion or look for a shift in role, I think can be important. And I think, the last thing was just sort of looking at sort of little behavior changes. I found that, with people, like all of a sudden I was like, that person never has their video on anymore. And they used to always have their video on. Right. Or like that person used to, hit me up on Slack, maybe every couple of weeks and say they had an idea about something. I haven't heard from them in a while. So that was a little harder to sort of put the math around it. But I do think just paying attention to behavior change within the team is important.
Yeah, very well said. That lack of engagement is definitely a huge signal for, people starting to feel the stress accumulate within a workplace. Brett, ask you the same question. When you're thinking about employee burnout and you're starting to look for, behaviors or how that's going to materialize within teams, what are some things that you've seen? What are some things that you might be looking for?
Yeah, I would say that one, to Mike's point, it's that active disengagement. You can see the trends within your team. You know who's the most vocal and who's always been the most vocal. But as with performance, right, you're starting to see this fall off of they used to be a B and now they're becoming a C player within team environments, right? Or they are not coming to the Zoom happy hours. And disengagement doesn't always necessarily mean just disengagement in the workplace, right? I can have my Zoom on for 10 calls a day and be so happy talking to all of my clients, and then absolutely want my camera off when I sign into a team meeting because I don't have the energy for you anymore. I think it's really important when I speak to HR leaders even to give it a name and a face, to say, hey, I see that you're not turning on your camera. Is everything okay? It's really important for leaders to lean in heavily on, to Mike's point, I can't measure this, but I'm noticing it. Can you help me identify what it could be? And then elevating that even further to the team. Hey, I'm starting to see this trend across the team with cameras off. Are you guys feeling this way as well? And opening that space to that open dialogue, now that it has a name and a face, will create better opportunities for others to express burnout they may be experiencing that aren't similar, but within the same vein as their colleagues. And then having that dialogue then creates the connection, and we're starting to foster a new kind of workplace, right? Even if it's more digital.
Yeah, that's a good observation. And I don't want to put words in either of y'all's mouth, but it sounds like, and kind of something I wanted to dig into you guys with a little bit more. It sounds like ultimately burnout is going to materialize itself in different ways across employees, right? And it can't always be categorized the same. So do you guys agree with that perspective? I mean, is it going to show up in different ways with different employees? And I guess on top of that, we don't have to get into the specifics quite yet, but the way you respond to that, is that different on an employee by employee basis, or do you kind of have a generalized approach to trying to mitigate that burnout? I'll throw that to whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I think it's sort of like how I think about coaching people, right? Everyone has things that they need to work on and things that they don't. And I think the same thing is with this. I don't know that there's sort of a cookie cutter approach to it, but I would say that there are some just baseline things. Again, are you engaged? Are you taking time away from work? I think those are universal, but I do think you need to think about the specific person and their individual sort of reasons for burnout and what might help them get out of that mode.
Yeah.
I would add to that I think the term burnout is actually being used as when they are at the peak of their burnout, right? And so This is when it looks the worst. But burnout is slowly occurring for a person, and it could be happening again on multiple layers of them as an individual. So I'm burnt out from teaching my kids 3 days a week in a work environment or in a homeschool environment, and then having to have my camera on all day, and then having to, do whatever responsibilities I have. So it can't be cookie cutter because it was layers and days and months that burnout had to occur. And if everyone, I think there was a study done in 2021, 89% of people said they experienced burnout. But if you had one-on-one conversations with them, it could be I was burnt out because I was dealing with a passing in my family and then expect it to be on. or whatever it might be, right? So there can't be one size fits all because we're trying to label the peak as what's happening across the board, and that's not the truth, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's an important shift in perspective, right? We talked about the change in culture being to focus on this materialization of this burnout, but to your point, how do we get ahead of it? If we're not addressing it earlier on in the process, like we're not actually combating it effectively. And again, it's generally a compound of all these different types of issues. And so unless the process or the sort of the treatment of this issue is prescriptive throughout, you're not really going to get anywhere with it. So, Brett, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question to that, because I want to get your perspective on sort of the consequences or the impacts. Like when you're seeing this materialize in different teams, how is it impacting the organization as a whole? Like we talked about the precedent of like we're shifting culture and trying to focus on this as an issue that's actually has a negative impact on the business. But like curious how you've seen that materialize and what challenges that's presented on an organizational level.
Yeah, so I think there's, not to be trending with this word, but there's layers to that answer.
Sure.
I would definitely say that one, on an individual level, cross teams, not at the leadership level, but as an independent or individual contributor, right? If you're seeing burnout on a team member, that usually is helpful to your sales process. I'm going to use sales as an example. There's pressure on me to identify it and to tell others like, hey, this implementation person used to be my star performer and I'm not really getting the same product out of them. And I'm not trying to throw them under a bus, but this is impacting my work, right? So how do we empower others to say, I'm seeing burnout happening? And then across that business, right? How does that translate to our customers? I always say this is like my key thing, and I stole it from John Barrow, so it's not original. But sales for me is just a transfer of enthusiasm, right? So if I'm no longer transferring my enthusiasm, people aren't as excited to buy from me. They're not as excited about my product. And it could just be that I'm having a bad day, but how sad for Blueboard, for example, if they don't get that extra sale because I was disheartened by the process or by the people I'm working with, right? And so that's some of the main ways is how does that translate to your customers when people are feeling burnt out?
So Mike, I'm gonna come back to a question in the chat with you, Britt, because you brought up a good point there. But Mike, I'm curious from your perspective as a revenue leader and as a team leader as well, where have you seen that materialize in the business? How is it impacting the organization? What kind of drawbacks materialize because of untreated employee burnout?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's low output of work, right? I mean, sales is such a mental game. How you carry yourself on a call, people read that, even if it's virtual. People know that, and again, I think to Britt's point, they may not know how to translate that. It could be that they interpret that as that means you're not excited about your selling, instead of being you just had a bad day or you're just whatever, something else going on in your life. So definitely around output. I think the second thing is that when people get burned out, like sometimes they peace out, they leave, and now you have to go replace them. And now you got to go hire somebody. You have to spend all the time, to do that. You have lost productivity in that territory because even if you assign someone to it, how much work really happens because someone's like, I'm only going to get a holdover for 2 months. So, right. So it really is a big deal. It affects all those things, both current output and potential future output.
Sure. So I want to touch on a quick question that came in through the chat. And Britt, again, you kind of touched on this where you're like, hey, like I have to pay attention to my team's behavior and recognize what's happening throughout the organization. And like very often, cross teams is where you're going to see that burnout materialize before it maybe escalates to an executive level. So I'll ask you both. Britt, I'm going to start with you. Like, do you have any recommendations or best practices on how to kind of flag these burnout concerns with upper management, or how to escalate them in a way that's, not disruptive to the employee that's experiencing it, but also to get attention to it and help get some eyes on it to make sure that it's being addressed. Curious for your thoughts on best practices to do that.
Yeah, and I'm lucky that I work in a very humanizing space, but I think humanizing the discussion. So when I have seen burnout, particularly across teams, I actually will put time on their calendar and say, hey, let's connect. We haven't did the water cooler thing in a while. Let's just get after it. And oftentimes, if you turn on my calendar, you'll see random Blueboarders on my calendar because I get this sense that, it's burning out. But I talk to HR leaders about burnout all day long. So, and then once I've had enough discussions where I feel strongly about this particular person or this issue being a burnout, then am I comfortable enough to go to my manager? And I think someone had posted a question, what if your director themselves is, experiencing burnout, which I've seen as well in the workplace. And then that's where you really have to lean in even higher up. And do you have a strong HR team? Do you have Slack communication channels? Keep it more general. Like, hey, is anyone else experiencing burnout? I have no problem as an empath being like, hey, I'm feeling this way. Even though it may not be my feelings, it's something I picked up from those conversations. I know that by posing that and having others weigh in, it will, again, create that sense of connection, like I'm not alone in this. And then that's something stronger that I can take to HR and say, see, here in Slack, we were talking about this. I think this is a real concern. Can we bring it up? And I also think, I guess one more point to this is, as far as the manager burnout goes, like, is there that whole feedback going all the way up? Like, is my manager empowered to tell HR that they're burnt out? And if not, can I create that space for them as well and say, hey, I don't even feel comfortable going to my manager right now. He's burnt out. I can tell how stressed he is on calls. Like, now what are we going to do to support him so that I feel more supported as well?
I really like that response. And so Colleen, I'm going to shout you out in the chat a little bit. I hope that's okay. But, she kind of made this comment of like, at times the expectation on HR is that it's like this expectation that they can resolve it is superhuman. And so I really love the idea of perpetuating a culture where we can kind of lean into each other and be supportive of each other to help circumvent that lift that is often required with the HR team. So Mike, that kind of leads me to another question I want to ask you. In sort of this leadership role, how do you have any best practices you can share with us on sort of perpetuating that type of culture, right? You talked about like how we're having to transition to this remote workforce and trying to create these environments where you have the same experience of like, hey, we can have a water cooler type of conversation. So I'm curious to pick your brain. Any best practices to help perpetuate that type of culture, particularly in this sort of new work environment?
I think one thing that's really important is that encouraging all your frontline managers. I mean, if you are a frontline manager, hopefully you're doing this, but if you manage managers or leaders, I think making sure that everybody is sort of having those probing conversations in their one-on-ones. And one of the things that we always did as a team at Malwarebytes is that we would talk about that stuff as a team. How are people doing? That was a question that we had our leadership calls and meetings. That's what we would talk about. And so it was an opportunity for people to sort of surface that. And I think how that sort of gets reacted to in a meeting like that is what sets its tone, right? If the tone is, that person's lazy or they suck or whatever, then of course, then now managers aren't going to be thinking about trying to find that and surface it. So I think it's really important to get everybody aligned with it and then make sure it's being discussed. And then we talk about what can we do to help. And I also think there's times that metrics can be really important here. I think just to tack onto if you want to bring this up to upper management, bring metrics, show how somebody was, their prospecting levels, and then all of a sudden it dropped, and then look how that's impacted their pipeline. Or talk about the turnover, like, look, we've already lost 2 people in the last month, and I think we're going to lose 2 more. And we know every time that happens, it costs us X. Those are the sorts of things that you're going to go up the chain that even if they don't care about humans, which hopefully they do, they certainly would care about metrics. So.
Sure. Yeah. Very robotic in that capacity. No, but I love it because I'm the same way. Like I lean super heavy into, our surveys and our employee NPS and that type of stuff. And I think now more than ever, it's probably more indicative of the actual environment. We should be paying attention to that stuff. So a great observation. So Mike, I want to stay with you. I want to jump into a more tactical level discussion of how we can start to address burnout when it happens, but also, again, get more proactive in putting in place tactics to address it and try to prevent some of it from happening, particularly because we're getting a lot of questions in the QA about it. So I figure it's a good segue. But Mike, again, I'm gonna lead off with you on this question. We have a good fundamental understanding how do we want to look for and identify this and classify the different types of burnout. Once we've seen it materialize within the organization, right? We have an employee or a team that's really struggling with this and like is really stressed out. How are you working to resolve that to help mitigate the overall impact on the organization and just try and put people in a better place?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for frontline managers, right, this is where they need to kind of figure out a plan, how they're going to sort of address this with the person. And I think that's back to this probing part. They need to know sort of what's going on and what the issue is. Sometimes it's the person is like new and they're just, they're trying to prospect and there's burnt out on prospecting without success. So let's figure out why that's happening. It could be that they just need some coaching on something, or maybe they need some help with more content or how to prioritize their time. So I think, first of all, again, just figuring out sort of why. I think more, if I look at it kind of across an org, I think, making sure that there's sort of this equal distribution of work, and depending on what it is, obviously reps, this should be fairly even because everyone should have similar quotas. But, I think a lot of times, if you look at like sales engineers, for example, or customer success people, where that stuff's a lot of times not as clear. And that's also where you'll see this sort of, wow, like everyone wants Kelly on this account because Kelly's our best. And it's like, oh, now Kelly's doing all this stuff and, Randy over here has got nothing to do. And so I think, again, also really understanding how that work is being distributed, I think, is another important piece of that. And I think find ways to have fun, right? Like, you got to find ways to have fun. Usually pre-COVID days, every quarter I would have the whole team over my house at the end of the quarter, and our level of party would depend on sort of, output. But we also did things like raffles, where we raffled off big screen TVs and stereos and whatever, Roombas, and just found ways to kind of just keep it light in that sense as well.
Sure. I really like what you said there, Mike, about understanding the root cause, right, and fundamentally getting to why the burnout is occurring. So I'm curious, in follow up to that, do you have any like best practices, kind of standard questions, like how are you trying to get to the root cause of that burnout with a particular employee or a particular team? Like, any best practices that you can share with the audience?
Oh, I wish I had some like script for you. I don't. I mean, I think, right, it's sort of just being naturally, in the same way, hopefully, as if you're a salesperson or a sales leader, you're naturally curious, right? I think there's just having I used to tell my managers, you need to be curious and you need to be genuine. I think that's another important point here. Like, you can't just go in there and just ask them 20 questions and, I asked all these things. It's like, people needs to be real. You need to actually care about these people and care about what's happening in their lives. And then if you marry that with curiosity, it's not, I don't think, as long as the person's not really closed off to sharing, I found most people are sort of willing to share. And I think it's also about being vulnerable back to them. It's okay to share about what's going on with yourself and how you're feeling about things. And I think if you can create that sort of two-way open conversation, that's going to go a lot farther than if you're just sort of robotically going through a checklist.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So there's no magic wand, is what you're saying. Do you wave and cure it? Yeah. It's disappointing, but I think that's good feedback. And I like the aspect of understanding the individual and paying attention to what that individual is going through. So Britt, I want to bounce back over to you. You talked about, again, mentioned before about like being somebody that teammates can lean into, which I think is a great best practice, and having those conversations and just being a shoulder to lean on, right? Like, but I'm curious, again, from your perspective, like once we've seen this burnout materialize with an individual, with a team, like what are some best practices that you can share with the audience about how to address it and how to help resolve it?
Yeah, I think I think that Mike kind of started to touch on something that's really important. It's authentic connection within the workplace. Above all else, people, I genuinely think, are looking for purpose beyond a paycheck, and they're looking for relationships beyond just colleagues. And in post or pre-pandemic world, that was really easy to craft with things like parties, but we're not able to do that. So how are you building authentic connection so that maybe burnout organically comes up? And also, maybe burnout's not just because they're having a hard time with their manager or their workload. And so what are the relationships or channels for relationships that the team has in place to proactively address those or identify it once it starts to show up? So, are there channels for feedback? Like, could you do this in your annual or biannual reviews with your manager and start incorporating more questions related to burnout? Or, in Slack, or whatever communication channels you have, could there be a weekly question? And every once in a while you drip something in there about, how are you feeling emotionally outside of the workplace? And do you feel like that impacts your day-to-day life in the workplace, right? And then create opportunities for fun as well. At our company, we have a channel called Blueboarding, but it's about what was your experience this weekend? What did you do? Before we all signed on, I was telling you guys I took a glass fusion class with my friends, and it was so awesome. We made a coral bowl, and I just got scuba certified. And when I post photos like that, other people who I've never met because they were hired during the pandemic are like, I actually love glass blowing, and this is a huge hobby of mine. And or someone posts about Disneyland, and now we have a Disney Heads channel, and they're able to connect. And having someone you can turn to at the end of the day, it doesn't need to be this big thing like we need to invest in a wellness budget or everyone's mind's going to explode. It could just be we need to start focusing on proactively creating these channels for connection so that the burnout can be mitigated again before it hits that peak. So that whenever the little things start showing up in those organic conversations, we can identify it easier.
Yeah. And I like that you touched on, Britt, like kind of swimming upstream and getting ahead of it, right? Like I love the idea of like the Slack channel and kind of creating this community in this organization, because it's less about like, hey, this is manifested and now I have to deal with it. And it's more like, how do I prevent it and get in front of it? I'm curious. I don't know if you have any additional best practices, but I know that you said you talk to HR leaders quite a bit in your current role, and I'm curious if you've heard other best practices that people are putting in place to kind of mitigate that burnout materializing, right? To get in front of it and to keep it from like becoming this huge problem. Like I don't know if you have any other best practices that you could share with us, but be curious for your perspective.
I think. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the 5 love languages, but the 5 love languages in the workplace are languages of appreciation in the workplace, right? Those are real. We are humans showing up, having human experiences. We need to be told we're doing a great job. We need those opportunities for connection or feedback or whatever it might be, right? And so a lot of the HR leaders I'm speaking to right now, the top things for them are we empowering our managers to give authentic recognition in real time so that, you just closed a huge deal. It took weeks and weeks and you were working after hours, but we gave you recognition and you feel like you did more for the company than just make us money, right? And so giving them the empowerment to do spot recognition or having more tools for peer-to-peer recognition so that the small things don't go unnoticed on the day-to-day now that we're not bumping elbows anymore. I also think for the first time ever, values are really being elevated within organizations. How are they living out our values now that we don't see Sally walking up and down the office every day shaking everyone's hand, right? So are they doing things that are elevating our company values in other ways? And then how do we elevate that further? So that again, it's more, do I want to mimic these behaviors? Is this how I would like to get recognized? I want to lean into that and do more of that and putting more of the positive spin into the workplace as opposed to constantly being reactive to the burnout.
Love it. I think those are great. Mike, I ask you the same question. Curious to hear again, like what practices you might put in place or where you've kind of leaned into prevention and trying to get ahead of burnout materializing within your employees or your teams.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, Andrew, about surveys. So our companies do surveys, but I actually did my own survey, and I was able to kind of craft it a little bit differently and create my own sort of profiles to track people a little differently. And we did it quarter over quarter, and we actually could see sort of by team or by the different cohorts what was changing. And it was a really helpful way to start to see, like, interesting, like everybody in this segment seems to be getting a little bit uncomfortable in all the comments. And then there was open-ended time to people to write in things as well. And you could read it and you're like, wow. So you could just see, I think that's one way you can do it is hopefully if you encourage people to be candid and make sure they know you're not like tracking down an individual person, and you obviously not do that as well. But it's a really great way for me. I was always like, okay, like I could see how the org was sort of changing quarter over quarter in a way that it was just very difficult, especially if you have a large org, just to get that same finger on the pulse. And now that we're work from home, even more and more difficult. There's no vibe. You can't just like walk through the sales floor and what's the, it doesn't exist. So.
Yeah. A lot of the tonality, a lot of the context is gone. So yeah, share similar perspective, right? Like in my surveying, I'm trying to identify like, okay, let's obviously make it easy to leave feedback and let's make it random so people aren't getting called out. But like, what are the lead metrics associated to churn, right? Like, what are the most important things? Like, Brett, I think you said this earlier. Like, maybe people don't care if like I buy them a gym membership or not, but they care about like my mental health. And so it's picking the right questions and the stuff that most directly translates into that retention, into that churn. And also like things like happiness, satisfaction, right? And being able to drive down into those and really being, again, looking at those metrics and their trend before you actually get to a situation where it's like, hey, they were a 10 and now they're a 5 and I haven't done anything about it. So yeah, I love all the, we're getting a ton of, just an aside, we're getting a ton of 5 love language links in the chat right now, which I think is awesome. So, and Hannah, actually, thank you for putting a blog. So Blueboard has a blog related to the 5 love language, which she linked in here, and it looks like there's some awesome content. So yeah, for all the attendees, check out the links in the chat. So, and definitely read the 5 love languages if you haven't, it will help you across the board. Cool. So before we start to dive into QA, we got a bunch of questions. There's a bunch of questions coming through in the chat. I'll leave this open to whoever who wants to take it on first. But Britt, Mike, anything else that you want to leave the group with as it relates to mitigating burnout? Any best practices? Any additional feedback you think the audience should know before we dive into their questions?
I don't know that. I don't know that I have anything else to specifically share, but obviously happy to answer questions.
I think I would just add that burnout seems so broad, and I do feel like I talk to so many leaders who sign on and they're like, "Oh no, everyone's burnt out," and I'm like, "Well, what does that mean?" And some will say, "Well, we're getting high attrition rates," or we're seeing on surveys we're not doing recognition enough. And even per company means something completely different. So be careful when you're using it as well with your team members, right? And just telling someone, hey, you seem burnt out might be taken in the wrong way. Like, I seem disengaged from work, as opposed to you're not turning on your camera, or you seem sad when you do turn on your camera, right? So being authentic with your questioning, or trying to create that relationship gap before you dive into it. I always find, even in sales, right, it's all about storytelling, but like, tell a story first, and that might create a safer space for people to say, oh, you're not accusing me of not getting my work done on time. That's what I thought you meant by burnout. What you meant the whole time is that, I'm feeling a little sad today, or I'm, again, worried about my dog being sick or walking behind my camera. So it's just a little bit different. Don't try to label it straight off the gate. Allow them the opportunity to tell you.
So it's, I'm glad you made that point, and maybe you looked at the QA preemptively, but we had a question from Nina, who was basically said and asked the group, like, do you think the term burnout is being thrown around too loosely? I've said it about 4,000 times on this call, and it feels patronizing already, and I'm not even talking to my employees. So is it safe to assume, Britt, that you share that sentiment? It's like, that might be a bit too general of a term right now.
Yeah, I think it became very popular with the Great Resignation, right? And so everyone's just like, everyone's resigning because they're burnt out, or because they don't want to return to the office, right? If you listen to NPR, those are the reasons everyone's leaving. And it's not. There's so many layers to it, guys. And like, so yeah, that's definitely the sentiment I share, is lean in a little more into the why. What's the why?
Yeah, I would, it's interesting, because even in Mike, as we were talking about these survey results, like, you'll see things like NPS score of the organization is like super high, right? And employee engagement is super high. And then you'll have like wellness or happiness can be low. And so it's like, hey, I may not necessarily be like ready to resign or to walk out the door, but there's a dissatisfaction there that hasn't been addressed. And it's probably in a lot of ways magnified. So Mike, I'm curious for your perspective on that as well. Do you think it's a term that's being used too much, or is too generalized at this point?
Yeah, I mean, clearly. I mean, because again, if you think about all the sort of subcategories or reasons why this is happening, and can that all be sort of classified as burnout? I also think, like, right, like, people have been burned out forever. I mean, it's not like this is some new issue. It's just now it's getting the attention of leadership and organizations. But I mean, think about the poor people that worked in factories 100 years ago. I mean, 7 days a week. I mean, they were constant burnout. So it's all relative, I think. But yeah, I guess that's my answer on that.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with a lot of that. I feel like it's been an underlying issue. And Brett, you've talked about the Great Resignation multiple times. It's like, yeah, now my outside opportunities are just magnified. So it's probably more materialized now because of that than anything else. So I want to go back to dive more into the QA. Obviously, we've already kicked off down this pathway, so we might as well stick with it. But there was a follow-up question to one of the points you made earlier, Mike, about making sure people are taking enough leave and they're stepping away and taking the appropriate distance from work. And so the question specifically was from Colleen, and it's how do you effectively communicate the importance of leave? And when an officer is on leave, calling them every day or every other day to have discussions about work is not okay. So basically, like, perpetuate the importance of taking your leave and taking your vacation, and also setting boundaries around your communication. Are there any best practices that you are implementing with your team today?
Well, I don't know. I would say one thing is that you got to lead by example, right? So if you don't ever take time off, then people probably aren't going to feel comfortable taking time off. So that's something it's important. Take your time off, and then when you do take time off, do your best to really shut down. I mean, it's hard because I'm not really great at that, especially with sales stuff. It's like, you're always kind of on. I think it's one of the harder roles to sort of step away from. But as much as you can, really, like, when you do go away, like, turn off and encourage people. Like, if people are working when they're on vacation, I always am like, look, don't, like, what are you doing? Like, don't work. So make sure that everyone's sort of aligned with that. Don't send them emails. Don't invite them to calls. I mean, sometimes there's like urgent, crazy stuff, but in general, respect that. And I think, again, this rolls downhill, right? So it's like, however you sort of set it up, it's how your managers and directors will think, and so far in their teams as well. So it needs to sort of be demonstrated in every aspect of the team.
Yeah, I agree with it. It's very much a lead by example case is probably the most effective way. So Brett, curious for your perspective. How are you maintaining balance? How are you setting boundaries with communication inside and outside work hours, and basically prioritizing time away?
I'm terrible at this. I answered a call on a boat to go scuba diving on my vacation where I swore I wasn't going to work, and I answered a procurement call. And I was like, yeah, no, I can do this. But boundaries are very important. I think boundaries, we need to realize some people haven't had human interaction this week. So them interacting with us is the only thing they've had outside of their home, because we don't have the opportunity, some of us, to go back to the office anymore. Like, it just dissolved. And then there's that other part where you're in my home all the time. So I don't turn off my computer at 10 p.m. It's sitting there watching Love is Blind with me. And so for me, it's very important that I let people know I don't have Slack on all the time. And Slack is a huge, deterrent from my day-to-day job that I need to do. I do tell people when I'm going to be away, maybe not my clients, but at least my colleagues, and take that seriously. And I do think that authentically, even if you're not getting it from your manager, try to create this space for other people, right? Because connection's so key. It can be achieved in a digital world. Hannah, I was off on Friday. Hannah is one of my colleagues here, and she wrote me and then realized I was out. She was like, do not respond to this. You are out of the office. But it took her to say that for me to be like, you're right. I'm not going to work right now, even though I totally read that message. And so be that person for others as well. Even if it's not coming from a top down, you can do it across the org organically.
Yeah. You can tell we're all in sales because we're all talking about working on our days off, which is just, it's a common thing amongst revenue teams.
We chose this life. I like.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, it's funny. Our organization is currently testing the 4-day work week, and on the sales team, we're like, we end up working a lot very often on those days. So we know how it goes. Cool. No, those are both great. And I think, again, I would agree that sort of, especially now since we're remote, and Britt, you touched on this, like, work is in my home. Like, how do I separate and distance myself from it, and setting those boundaries and getting the team to recognize it is critical. And I love, again, like the lead by example piece. Like, you do have to set the tone for your organization as a revenue leader. So I want to jump into another question. It's a little bit of a segue because it's unrelated, but I come up throughout in the Q&A and also in the chat. The question originated specifically like, how do we balance the responsibility of resolving burnout? So very often this is seen as something like, well, HR needs to own this. And we talked a little bit about the tactical execution of it, but I just want to touch on it again. Like, I'm curious to pick y'all's brain. How have you seen the responsibility distributed amongst different teams to try and help mitigate that burnout, like, and give ownership to either peers or other teams to kind of get in front of burnout and to help resolve it? Because I do think very often it's just like, oh, hey, that's an HR issue, go deal with it. Hey, it's something that you need to talk to HR issue. But how do we, I guess maybe a better question, Mike, I'll kick this off with you. how do you empower your teams or your peers to try and get in front of this and try to be a partner in helping resolve burnout across the organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my view is that ultimately their manager, if you're the manager, you're responsible for this. I mean, this comes down to the relationship you have as someone's manager. It also comes down to, again, their output is going to directly affect your paycheck. So I would also think you'd be very financially motivated to make sure this is working. But so I view HR's role as really being a good, business partner, saying, hey, I'm gonna, we've got programs, we've got Blueboard, you need coaching on this, you need training on how to work. I mean, that's where I view HR as coming in, as really being a good support, enablement, providing content, providing tools. But at the end of the day, this is management's fault. I shouldn't say fault, God, management's responsibility, and ultimately up the chain from there.
Sure. Brett, I'm curious to ask you the same question. I mean, obviously, you guys are really helping as an organization create an experience to help teams do that, right? To directly kind of get in front of this and help overcome it in a lot of ways. So, again, curious to pick your brain quickly on any best practices you'd like to share around that.
Yeah, I guess my perspective more as an independent contributor is take ownership. If you're feeling burnout, speak up. If you're not feeling supported, find a channel where you can feel supported. Maybe it's your work bestie. Maybe it's your marketing director because they happen to ask you how your day was going anyway. I also think, again, keep it authentic. Don't try to make it a big umbrella. We have a team in the Ukraine, and on the day that the invasion happened, someone said, I can't work right now. This is what I'm thinking about. And someone saying that made it authentic for all of us to be like, cool, I'm glad you can't turn off the news either. I can't focus. And then HR was able to come and step in and say, we're actually going to cancel meetings today. This matters, and it matters to you guys. And that was authentic, but it came from the people, right? So be empowered to be authentic about what you're going through so you can take ownership over it.
Yeah, I love that. I think there is too often we kind of get away from the sort of personal accountability. And it's like, yes, ultimately, like, managers, your organization will have an impact on your experience and your well-being, but at the same time, on an individual level, you should take ownership from it. If it's impacting you, like, there's resources there. Like, if your organization is making those resources available, absolutely take advantage of them. So cool. I appreciate you guys going through the QA. We got a lot of good questions, so I wanted to cover those off. Really quickly, let's summate in any kind of key takeaways. Again, any last minute best practices. Britt, I'm going to kick it over to you to kind of finish us out. And then Mike, I'll ask for any takeaways that you have and follow up to this call. But yeah, Britt, anything you'd care to share with the group, or any observations that you're going to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think we can all start thinking more proactive as opposed to reactive. It's time. Like, we don't have to keep blaming the Great Resignation on the burnout. You have a lot of great people looking at your company too. So what are you doing? How are you creating those authentic connections? How are you transforming yourself in this digital world to stay interactive with your manager, with your teams, to be proactive about your happiness within the workplace, and be vocal whenever you're unhappy, and understand that that's not organically going to happen now standing next to the water cooler. So making sure that, again, it's connections in all directions, and that could be getting the help you need to prevent your own burnout as well.
Awesome. Mike?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. As we're talking, I was like, wow, I don't have any of this documented anywhere. And I think one of my takeaways is that it's probably not enough as a leader to just sort of coach your team verbally on this stuff. I think it's important to actually put some structure around it, provide some, actually written resources. And so anyway, that was kind of my takeaway. Something I think I want to go do now, which I think will hopefully be helpful.
It's interesting you say that. I felt very much the same way. I'm like, this is cool. We do a lot of this stuff, but there's just not sort of I don't know, maybe it's SOPing it is not the way to go. But I really like the point, Brett, that you flagged about, like, encouraging teams to be collaborative resources and to help each other in setting up that environment. And I think that's something that, we don't, as a revenue team, perpetuate enough of today. It's very much like, hey, what are surveys? How are you feeling, et cetera. But how do I empower teams and managers to better be able to do that? And again, I think documenting a lot of that is a great methodology. So yeah, some good takeaways. Cool. Well, that's it for the conversation today. I appreciate everybody's time in the audience. Eduardo, anything to add on the MSP side?
Hi,
Hi.
back.
Oh, I think you're muted, Eduardo.
Hi, can you hear me now? All right, great. Thank you very much, panelists. I think we are not having conversations like this enough, right? It's time for us to start thinking about proactively about burnout because it is a really big issue that companies have. So we are going to wrap things up for now, but first we want to thank everyone who attended today. We loved having you here. And thank you to our panelists and Blueboard for sponsoring this event. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. Everyone took a lot of notes. And while the panelists and I hang out backstage, our MSP team will make sure the recordings and the key takeaways are available on our site shortly. And once you're there, check the recording. To check the recording, don't forget to also check our upcoming event. And stay safe, and we will see you next time. So panelists, let's go backstage. Thank you.